What we're going to talk about again is the process of training and what happened following Inayat Khan's passing regarding Rabia Martin. Some of the materials that I used as sources for this might be a little new to the Baba community. I have a friend who's a PhD of comparative religion, Talat Hallman, who was kind enough to write a foreword to my book. I've known Talat via email and phone calls for some years, probably about 10 years. And I got curious. I'm a very curious person. I got curious about this process, what might have happened. And I was talking to him. Talat is a unique being. He is a Meher Baba devotee. He's also his family are from Turkey. He is in fact Turkish. And he's a Bektashi Sufi. And said, I'm interested in this period. What would be the best way of just diving into it? And he said, well, my friend, you're in luck. Turned out that Talat was the dissertation advisor to Pir Zia Inayat Khan, who is the current head of the Inayati order, and had a pointer to Pir Zia's dissertation, which is a 400-page or 377-page PDF document, and I downloaded it and began to rake through it. He also supplied me with another unique document, which was a record of Rabia Martin and Inayat Khan's correspondence from 1911 to 1927, a period of 16 years. I also dug around. I found a wonderful piece called A Sunrise in the West, Hazrat Inayat Khan's Legacy in California by Murshid Wali Ali Meyer, who is Sufi Sam's successor. There's also always Lord Meher online, and I dug into a biography of Hazrat Inayat Khan by Elizabeth Keesing. So this is not, I did my best to maintain a chronology of information, and I felt that I needed to start in the article prior to Inayat Khan's departure from India. His master, Madani, was Murshid in the Chishti, Qadri, Surawardi, and there's one more, Naqshbandi order, which is kind of typical of teachers in the subcontinent in those days. They would get initiated into multiple tariqas or orders. And Madani had brought Inayat Khan along, and he was at that time a Khalifa. In 1907, he appointed Inayat Khan full Murshid and informed him that Prophet Muhammad had appeared to him, Murshid Madani, in a dream, and that Inayat Khan was to go to the West and spread the message of Sufism in the West. And please remember that Moinuddin and Chishti was the one who had brought Sufism to India back in the 1100s, or 1200s. So Inayat Khan agreed, but he kind of stalled around for about 3 years. He was still learning, he felt, and he also was a fine musician. His family were well-known virtuosos in the subcontinent, and he actually did some recording between 1907 and 1910. Some of these are available online, and these guys were hot. I mean, they were truly virtuosos in the classical, Indian classical. His instrument, well, he was Veena. I've seen pictures of him with a sarod, but the differences between those instruments are nebulous to me, at least. I'm a keyboardist and not a string player, so maybe guitarists would say, oh, that's clearly a sarod. But they had a family band, and essentially, as of 1910, Madani had passed, Inayat Khan's father had passed, and finally they booked passage to New York City. He had prearranged to be an accompanying band to a dancer of the day named Ruth St. Denis. And they did, in fact, rendezvous with Ruth St. Denis and literally traveled their way across the United States. You gotta think about this. In 1910, we have a Western woman purporting to do Indian dance to actual Indian classical music. And they managed to, they went all the way to San Francisco, but by that time, Inayat Khan, I think, had had enough, and he thought that the band behind her, that the whole package was being considered entertainment. And that was not why he'd been sent to the West at all. So he severed, basically quit as band leader for her. He was invited to speak in April 1911 at the San Francisco Vedanta Temple and met this woman, Ada Martin. And she soon became his first Western disciple. The dissertation from Pirzia states this was the beginning of Inayat Khan's Sufi work. In other words, the actual work in the West began with this one person's recruitment. He stated, several others were initiated in the wake of Martin, but she was to remain Inayat Khan's primary student and prospective representative in America. And he didn't stay. He already had traversed the United States and was getting good at getting publicity and getting gigs. And he left to continue to lecture and do concerts, minus Ruth St. Denis, of course. But they began a correspondence that were of hundreds of letters. Because this was in the days, obviously, before long-distance phone calls were even possible, especially when they returned to Britain. Letters, luckily, we have them. She was new to Islam and new to the concept of Sufism, but he must have been a very compelling speaker. He began her instruction while he was there in the San Francisco area, but they continued it via letter. And what he began with her was what I would term to create a medieval Sufi order. And I don't mean medieval in the sense of dungeons. I mean medieval in the terms of a classical Sufi order from the 12th century, 10th century, where you've got a very simple structure. You've got a fairly enlightened Murshid, and you've got perhaps have some assistants known as caliphs, and you've got a pool of students known as murids. Murid means aspirant, by the way, and so there's a very simple structure in which a person's rank in the order is directly linked to their spiritual attainments. No questions. It's somebody exhibits certain characteristics. The Murshid is equipped to recognize this, and they will be elevated if it's appropriate. I had an interesting conversation earlier today where the idea of Sufi teacher was kind of questioned. How can somebody just set themselves up as teacher, as Murshid? And the answer is only in America. Within India and in the East in general, there is a very, very structured structured training format in that one has to go through the ranks. One needs to become a murid and then possibly a khalifa if that's something that, that the order utilizes. And then eventually, sometimes many years later, sometimes very quickly, you know that there's as many paths to God as there are beings. But a Murshid is deemed to know certain things, and they are granted what's called an ijazatnama. Ijazatnama is essentially a statement by the Murshid that this murid, I am elevating him or her to Murshid status. And here is the kinds of things that he or she is able to teach. And here is my silsila. Now, silsila is an Arabic word, and it means chain. Literally means chain, a physical chain. And in their case, the Sufis prize their connection back, person to person, all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad and to the angel Gabriel, who visited him in a cage and said, recite. All of the Sufi work, that is their goal, is to attain the heart space that the Prophet Muhammad enjoyed. And he continued conversations with the angel Gabriel, Jibril, for 33 years, 23 years, age 40 to 63. In that time, Jibril would tell him things, and then he would turn around and recite it back to the community, where it would get eventually written down. And the Quran is essentially the words of God as related by Jibril through Muhammad. There's another category of information in the Islamic world called hadith, and hadith are the sayings of the Prophet, the doings of the Prophet, and we stretch it a little bit farther, the actions and words of the companions of the Prophet. So there's quite, just within Islam, there is a regular course of study, and a Kamil Sheikh, a realized Sheikh, needs to know the tenets of Islam, understand the Quran, understand hadith. So the point is that Rabia Martin was getting information via letter, getting instruction via letter from Hazrat Inayat Khan, and in standard Islamic jurisprudence, he had her studying the Quran, studying Arabic, reading the hadith, essentially paralleling what would happen in a Mumbai, Kaka order, or in Karachi, what would happen inside a circle led by a Murshid or Murshida.
Could you give the background of where Murshida Martin came from, her background before she met him?
You know, I've got to say, Jim, that's not, she like sprang into existence the day she met Inayat Khan. Please forgive. Yes, Ira.
She was a Russian Jewish woman.
That's what I wanted to bring up.
And
quite an interesting background to go into this.
And she had studied many different mystical paths. And the story I had heard wasn't that Inayat Khan had met her at the Vedanta Society, but rather she was in the audience of a concert he had given, and he had noticed her. He later explained she drank every word out, every sound that came out of him that was of spiritual significance. She filtered it just like the mythical swan that drinks the mixture of the water and the milk, the Paramahansa. And she sensed, he never announced that he was a teacher. She went over to him at the end of the concert and she said, I know you are a great spiritual master. Can I be your student? That's when he began his work. She found him.
She must have been very ready. So Pura Zita then tells us, it's evident that Rabia Martin in particular received an intensive and systematic course of esoteric training that differed little in form from from the Sufism practiced among Chishti initiates in India. So this is, she's building something there first in San Francisco and then in Marin. Something that I would think of as a very, very traditional and, as I said again, medieval Chishti order. So, as Hazrat Inayat Khan continued to play and lecture in America for the rest of 1911. They traveled in early 1912 to Britain, and he established a headquarters in London. He had both concerts, because he's bringing his band. His Hindustani, let's see, I've got the names of these guys. Did I lose? Come on, Carl, it's only 5 pages. There we are. The Royal Musicians of Hindustan. Ali Khan, looks like on tambura, Inayat Khan, Musharraf Khan, and Mahbub Khan. So these are all either his brothers or his cousins. So they repaired to London, and between 1912 and 1914, he basically hooked up with the Theosophical societies and would give lectures at various Theosophical societies around Britain and in France. But things clearly got shut down hard as of the declaration of war in 1914. But in 1913, he met Ora Ray Baker, who was cousin of Mary Baker Eddy, who was the founder of the Christian Science movement.
She was at her niece, actually.
Yeah, okay, cousin, I've got cousin down. But he named her Amina Begum, and they were married that year. I did not pursue that very far, but rumor has it that she was a volatile being. But war stranded them in Britain, and he continued to lecture and play around Britain. And 2 of their children were born during the war, Vilayat in 1916 and his younger brother Hidayat in 1917. Now, during the war, in 1915, you recall that the Turks wanted to become part of Europe, but they decided to vote. They wanted to modernize to a degree, but they decided that the Kaiser was a better bet than France or Britain. And so the Turks took the side of Germany. And this means that, that Gallipoli in Turkey became months-long battlefield. This had a scale that equaled some of the fighting in Flanders and elsewhere in Europe, but history has not treated it well. It's become kind of a footnote, but not to the British people. They committed a lot of troops, both British, Australian, and New Zealand, to the war in Turkey, at Gallipoli specifically. And it lasted through the spring and through the summer into the fall. It was very bloody. And frankly, the British were losing badly because they weren't on their home ground. They had extended supply lines, etc. All the things that come true in a war. And there was a lot of anti-Turkish and, by extension, anti-Islamic sentiment in Britain during those years. And Pierre Zia noted it in his diss that the Islamic content of the various pamphlets and writings and lectures given by Inayat Khan got softened. The word Allah became God. He did not talk about the traditional Sufi structures as we now know them. He was headed toward what he and Pierre Zia termed universal worship. And this was, according to Pierre Zia, because of the anti-Islamic sentiment in the British Isles at the time. They had a periodical called the Sufi, And as he says, as time progressed, Islamic references consistently diminished in all the order's publications. Remember, this is happening 6,000 miles away from Murshida Martin and her groups. So she's still doing 100% Muslim, as Islamic as possible with Californians, as an Islamic as possible replica of a Chishti order. And because she's 6,000 miles away, America did not have the same anti-Islam sentiments going on in the press and on a personal basis. And they're kind of doing their thing without a lot of pressure. Remember, she's not doing the lecture and concert circuit as Inayat Khan was. So she was, quoting Pirzia, she was making progress in San Francisco in 1918. She opened a center on Sutter Street in San Francisco and a second center, Kabbalah, in rural Marin County. Post-war, Inayat Khan and his family moved to Tremblay, France, and then they moved to Geneva. Inayat Khan had a lot of faith in the League of Nations, and this was formed in the wake of the war to end all wars in World War I. They did not imagine that this could ever recur. But in that time, he had been fairly active. He had lodges in Britain and France, and he tried to resuscitate the French ones after the war to some degree. I wanted to say, I've got a comment here in my notes that in all of this describing Inayat Khan's travels and efforts in Europe, he never loses sight of Rabia Martin. Other than Inayat Khan himself, Rabia Martin is the next most mentioned person in this 377-page dissertation of Pirzia. And it's clear the importance he's giving to her. He never shortchanges her in terms of space. I was very impressed by the even-handedness with which he dealt with her. And at this point, I've continued to go back between Pirzia's dissertation and this letter compendium that I had. And Inayat Khan will often share his thoughts with Rabia Martin in a way that he would not, even in his family group. He was, maybe because she was an unquestioning and skilled Murshid candidate, or not affected by the same political pressures that he was facing in Europe, really opened his heart and his mind to her in a way that I didn't see among any of the other letters. In 1920, Inayat Khan started a Paris Center and created what he called the Church of All. And this was a very heterodox movement. He was no longer requiring even the motions of converting to Islam. None of the prayer structures. They were still using the teaching methods, Sufi stories, zikr in the Arabic, etc. But no conversion, no bayat. There was a bayat, but there was no shahada. There was no allegiance to Islam as a Muslim Murid would have to go through. But in all these centers, he began to complicate the structure. He created, we already know about Murid as the aspirant, possible assistant Murshid in the name, in the title and role of Khalifa or lieutenant, and then of course a single Murshid for the order. He created an additional layer called Shirag, and Shirag is a Persian word, as Tom will tell us. It means lamp. And he also, okay, let's see. There was a note, a little structure inside the dissertation where I felt at first, I mean, where is he going with this? Where's Piercy going with this? But there was a movement within the Europeans to elevate, they'd had nothing to compare him to elevate Inayat Khan to the level of Rasul. They began to refer to Inayat Khan as Rasul, as the messenger of God. Possibly because this was an alien, a new concept. They felt him as a Jesus-like being among them, but they began to attribute infallibility to him. At the same time, if you've done your homework with Sufism, you know that there are levels of fana, or obliteration. First, a murid gets obliterated into his or her Murshid, so that's Fanafi Murshid. Then the Murshid takes you and elevates you, obliterates you into the living head of the order, Fanafi Sheikh, and then to Muhammad, Fanafi Rasul, and then at the end, Fanafi Allah. Identifying one with God, being one with God. So in a way, if Inayat Khan was in fact a Kamil Sheikh, a realized Murshid, in that sense, he was also one with Muhammad. So it's kind of an interesting point, but it explains some things that happened later among the Europeans, especially as regarding Rabia Martin. So we have to remember the very, very high regard that the Inayati in Europe held Inayat Khan. He was discoursing all around. I've got a map. It was unfortunately a very, very low resolution map I found on the internet that showed his travels around Europe between 1912, when he arrived in Britain, and 1927. And he traveled tens of thousands of miles around. He was an indefatigable traveler. He just absolutely loved it, apparently. And it seemed like everywhere he started, he must have been an incredibly charismatic speaker, because it seemed like every place he stopped, there was a small lodge would start, and these lodges would then consolidate. And over time, there were so many of them that he needed to create what we would think of as a business-like superstructure for it. There would be a secretary, there would be a recording secretary, there would be administrators, there was monies to collect and distribute. No news to the Baba community, but he organized this thing very, very well. He must have been an astounding administrator himself, all the while being their spiritual as well as temporal head. So these lodges, these khankas themselves had some layers of politics and positions that we weren't familiar with, or especially from subcontinental view. And then he was building this center in Geneva, where there's even more layers of subcommittees and sub-subcommittees and administration. There were about 20 lodges or centers, with Geneva remaining the headquarters. In 23, he returned to America for 3 months, and he stayed in San Francisco, probably mostly with Rabia Martin, for 7 weeks. He was discoursing all the while, and they were transcribing them, and they were sent to Geneva. They were beginning to publish, or continuing to publish his work. So one of the pieces of work happening in Geneva headquarters was they were becoming a publishing company. He came back to France after America and started revising the Sufi charter. He merged the Sufi order into the Sufi movement, including the brotherhood and universal worship. So you can see that there's all these entities that he'd been creating all along, and he's trying to get them into one sort of unified stack. And he also created a new center in Suresnes, France, where most of his family moved. he hired a Harvard-trained lawyer named Enrique Zanetti to create a new constitution for these merged groups. Continued to travel through 1924 through France, Switzerland, Italy, Germany, and England, and new centers usually followed every appearance. As I say, it would have been, what a delight it would have been to hear the man speak. He created new levels of certification inside what he called the esoteric school. There were 4 circles of initiation, each with 3 internal grades. So you see how complex this starts to get, both in people starting to, well, I'm grade 13 and I'm grade 11. And this again is an alien concept to me, because my introduction and experience is it's a very simple 2 or 3 level organization. Got the aspirants, you got the teacher. Teacher shares the knowledge as the aspirant is able to receive it, full stop. So things have gotten fairly intricate and complex, but all these layers are absent in the 2 groups led by Murshida Martin. One, to reiterate, he wore 2 hats. One was Pir Murshid of the esoteric school, and the other is the administrative head. They call it the representative general of the international Sufi movement. The thing is, he was always on the move. He was always gone. So, I need to catch us up. Here we are. I apologize, I'm going to begin to read. All right. I say here, what followed could have been foreseen and prevented. As the number of centers in multiple countries grew, there was an added bureaucratic level of administrators, all the way to the highest levels within the Sufi movement. Inayat Khan found himself simultaneously the Pir Murshid of the esoteric school, functioning as an Eastern-style spiritual master, endowed with the authority of Insan al-Kamil, or the perfect man, and also as the administrative head, the representative general of the international Sufi movement. Here we go. In late 1925, at an annual council meeting at Geneva headquarters, while Khan was traveling, a constitutional proposal was made to abolish the representative general's vote in the executive committee, because that position held both 4 votes and the power of veto. Politics and voting. As Pir Zia puts it, did the Sufi movement exist to serve the Pir Murshid's agenda, or did the Pir Murshid exist to serve the movement's agenda? Essentially, they were defining the difference between esoteric and exoteric authority. Some within the hierarchy of the movement felt strongly that as Khan was the messenger, and all such politics was destructive, since the Murshid was in a state of fanafillah. He was essentially the voice of God, infallible. Of course, this attitude defines or implies total dependence upon that individual. Others believed that Khan was so absorbed in the spiritual he had neither time nor interest in the temporal, using his frequent absences from meetings as evidence. A response to that was, a mystic is not dependent upon what various people tell him. So the result of this particular vote was 10 in favor, 7 against. When they presented this to Inayat Khan, he cast his 4 votes against, and the attempt to limit his constitutional powers failed. In a letter to his wife, he wrote, when a disciple begins to judge the teacher or his actions, to criticize his teachings, or test his inspiration or power, however cleverly he may do it, he ceases to be a disciple in the right sense of the word. It may not seem very bad to many, but there is a thin thread connecting the pupil with his spiritual guide, and at any moment this can easily break. Once broken, can never be mended. So Pir Zia states at this point that family lore had it that Inayat wanted to return to India, was only forestalled by the pleading of the family. They were afraid if he left Europe he would never return. and he needed a change of scene. Clearly, he sailed for New York, intending another tour of America. He wrote to Rabia from New York, "After the Geneva Council, if not for the cause, I would have left the whole affair and gone back to the East." So, prior to that departure from New York, Inayat performed initiation and investiture of his sons Vilayat and Hidayat, age 11 and 10, as Khalifas, lieutenants in the Sufi order. This will have important future repercussions. This event was echoed many years later when Pir Vilayat appointed his own son Zia as the future head of the Sufi order. This next section, America and India, the last days of Inayat Khan. He was hampered by ill health throughout the 1926 American tour. By February 1926, he was in Northern California, reunited with Rabia and her two groups. He met Nyogen Senzaki, a famous Zen teacher, and he later published an article about their meeting called Mohammedan Zen Sufism in America. Samuel Lewis, who had claimed to have been initiated in the astral planes by Inayat Khan, was granted 6 interviews. Lewis later stated that at the center of these, Khan bitterly complained about how few loyal murids he could actually claim. If true, he was still showing disapproval of the council meeting in Geneva. After the American tour, he returned to Europe, but I stayed here, and this is my interpretation of what I read in both the letters and in Pir Zia's dissertation. Clearly, no healing had taken place between him and the executive committee. He was determined to leave for India, accompanied only by a secretary, boarded ship from Italy on September 28, 1926. Landed in Karachi, traveled to Lahore, and then to Delhi. He'd been away from India for 16 years. Inayat Khan wrote, "My impression of India is not altogether good. Perhaps it is partly owing to my condition, which means its health, and partly by staying in Europe for so long. I have become more critical. They seem to me to be neglectful and dreamy." Inayat Khan did seek help for his health, and he reunited with Khwaja Hassan Nizami. Nizami was one of the premier Chishtis in India, and he's keeper of the Dargah of Nizamuddin Aliyah, and had a very widely read Sufi newspaper. And he published an account of their visit, terming Inayat Khan as our Murshid. So in January 27, he traveled to northern India and Ajmer in Rajasthan, attended the death anniversary, the Urs, of Khwaja Moeller Chishti, who was founder of the order in India. Pir Zia reports, soon after optimistically reporting that coming to Ajmer has done my broken spirit good, he was overtaken by severe influenza. And I returned to Delhi in mid-January, went downhill quickly, possibly from pneumonia. He passed at his residence in Delhi on February 5th, 1927, at age of 44. At that point, obviously, the correspondence between Inayat Khan and Rabia Martin is over. But there are still a lot of existing correspondence between, for example, people in the committee and Rabia, etc., and their journals. The information in the next little bit came from 2 sources. One is I found online, or this is part of what Talat Holman sent me, an article called "A Sunrise in the West, Hazrat Inayat Khan's Legacy" by Wali Ali Meyer, who's the head of the Rouhaniyat Sufi Sam's groups. And it's also echoed in a 19-page article in the November 2004 issue of Glow. The authorship of the article was unclear, but it begins with a page-long letter from Murshida Karl Khan. In the text, we are told, Inayat Khan informed his dear friend, fellow Chishti and spiritual advisor Hassan Nizami, the most prominent Sufi leader of India, that he had appointed Rabia full Murshida, a fact affirmed by Nizami when he reappointed her full Murshid in Delhi in 1939. Quote, 7 days before Inayat Khan's death in India, he, Inayat, told Hassan Nizami that he had named Rabia Martin, the American Murshida, as his successor. This is very straightforward, as they say. It comes from two different sources. One, Sufism reoriented, and another from Wali Ali. Now, Inayat Khan had appointed an attorney to revise the Constitution, Enrique Zanetti. He invited Rabia Martin to a meeting held in Suresnes, France. Both he, who was executive supervisor, and a fellow named Talwar Dusak, who was General Secretary of the Sufi Movement, seemed ready to accept Martin's claim as Khan's successor as a representative general, seen as an administrative or exoteric position. Pirzia states, Dusak's reasoning was threefold. 1, Martin was a senior Murshida. 2, she had proven administrative ability. And 3, Inayat Khan had praised her devotion to the message. Martin's internal map and perceptions proved to be quite different. Her actions and words in her only visit to the complex political infighting in the Sufi movement proved quite maladroit. She misread the entire situation. She lost the support of Zanetti and Dusak in one event, which is called the Sacred Readings of the Master. She began by addressing people she barely knew, some of whom had worked for the past 16 years to rise in the European movement as my dear Murids. She declined to read the prescribed sacred words of the Master and declared, I have not crossed the ocean to read to you from a paper, but to give you a solid teaching.
She was a nice Jewish girl.
Right here, she lost any chance of acceptance at that point. The International Executive Committee met at Geneva headquarters in September of 1927. The primary issue on the table was to appoint a representative general, which was the highest administrative post available, the political head of the order. Inayat's next younger brother, Mahbub, was elected unanimously, quote, for an indefinite period of time. 2 years later, in a letter from 1929, Rabia wrote to General Secretary Dusak, challenging the recognition of Mahbub Khan as the esoteric Pir Murshid of the entire order, stating, and now this is a direct lift from that letter. She says, the Pir Murshid in his esoteric rules says, Pir Murshid makes rules, his successor is designated by him. This, you must admit, is definite, and definite is underlined. It is not a matter to be voted upon, and voted is in italics. These are hers, by the way. And the spiritual reason why it cannot be voted upon is that it's a mystical degree, and it is only the Pir Murshid who can recognize and confirm this mystical degree of attainment. This state of hal, as you must know, comes only by the divine favor of Allah. In 1923, when Murshid came to America after an absence of 11 years, he remained as a guest in my home for more than 6 weeks. During that blessed and holy time, he conferred an initiation upon me as preparation for the one he completed when he was with us again in 1926. On March 16th, 1926, he conferred another most holy initiation, his last, and that initiation made me his esoteric successor, again in italics. Can you refer to a single messenger whose successor was chosen by vote, in italics? Either we draw our authority from God or from man, it is one or the other. So this is her very forceful letter back to, why it took her 2 years to write this letter, I'm a little unclear. And I write here, In her indignation, Rabia had utterly forgotten the events following the death of the Prophet Muhammad. As powerful as that letter was, she never received an invitation to the next 1930 Executive Committee meeting. That summer, Samuel Lewis sent at least one letter to the committee stating that Inayat Khan had asserted to him in 1926 that Rabia was indeed his successor and that he, Lewis, was to defend her and prevent her from defending herself. However, she could never resist getting a word in, and as Lewis wrote, and this led to her downfall. In 1930, before the meeting, Rabia was requested to provide some tangible proof supporting her claims, and she sent them a letter termed by Dusac later as containing slanderous allegations. I was unable to find a copy of this. I'd love to dish the deep dirt, but I don't have that letter. Further, the initiation she was given by Inayat Khan in 1926 had also been given to Mahbub Khan. Dusac pointed out that the norm was for an appointee to possess a written, an ijazatnama, or khalifatnama, a document mentioning the orders of Silla and the specific abilities and duties of the appointee. We discussed that earlier. Martin offered instead a turban given to her by Inayat Khan. Dusac pointed out that Khan's son Vilayat had been given his father's personal turban. The 1930 Executive Committee was fully attended except as usual for Rabia Martin. Rabia's letter was read, the one with all the exclamation points and italics. One of the members, Shabazz Best, commented that her language was forcible. Pirzia stated, in her defense, Best stated, I would, however, suggest that we should, as it were, exonerate her, because I understand that one of her race employs traditional language, and if we would understand that it is not necessarily personal, but an individual method of expression, we would be less moved by those words. Though offered in Martin's defense, his identification of Martin's shortcomings as symptomatic of her Jewish identity evokes the conviction of both Murshida Martin and Sam Lewis, apparently never committed to writing, but communicated orally that racism was a significant factor in the rejection of Martin's claim in Europe. And that defense was faint praise indeed. I honor Pirzia's honesty on the point of racism and possibly sexism. However, note the blame does not fall on the male Indian Muslim relatives of Inayat protecting their sources of income, but upon the voting members of the Executive Committee who were mostly white Europeans. He also said there is anecdotal, not written evidence that both Martin and Lewis, that believe that there was anti-Semitism involved in the general Executive Committee's decision. And Pirzia reproduces General Secretary Dusac's reply to Martin in full. I'm very near the end of this, kids. Quote, this statement seems to be most extraordinary, or is it not strange that Pir Murshid kept all the people of the Sufi movement ignorant that you were to be a successor, but made the disclosure of it to Mr. Samuel Lewis, who has no standing in the Sufi order, for whatever the value in your eyes to be a, quote, caliph by spiritual degree, unquote. However, let us admit that Mr. Lewis's statement was true, that he did not misinterpret the master's words, or that he did not imagine it, which is likely, for is it not well known that certain visionaries are subject to strange delusions and hallucinations? And you have declared, as well as Mr. Lewis himself, that he has visions. Even supposing his statement to be correct, we cannot take it into consideration, for we happen to have in this office written instructions from our blessed master urging us never to act upon anyone saying, Murshid has told me, but only to act upon what Murshid himself had told us. This is an extremely interesting letter. Dusac said Samuel Lewis had no standing in the Sufi order and proceeds to mock him for his visions, even though Inayat Khan himself had said that Lewis could indeed channel him, Inayat Khan, regardless of time or space. The visions comment seems to illustrate the gulf between the arid political environment of Geneva and Martin's geographically isolated order. She had created, under Inayat Khan's direction, an Indian, traditional, spiritually oriented group where there's a direct link between members' rank and their level of illumination. And I do an aside here. The reason Murshida Martin did not make Sam Lewis a Khalifa, or why it wasn't recognized in Geneva, not recoverable as far as I know. I'd also say the traditional Chishti Sama or Qawwali singing is designed to invoke Hal, which is an ecstatic, visionary state in the participants. General Secretary's dry and biting wit is hardly indicative of an ecstatic experience. However, in his defense, since the 1880s, the popular press had colored and confused genuine spiritual movements with spiritualism and occultism, with their myriad fake mediums and apparitions. The 1930 vote to elect Mahbub Khan as esoteric head and Pir Murshid of the Sufi order failed, and the committee split somewhat acrimoniously, with several European and British members severing all ties to the Sufi movement. When Rabia Martin received the news in San Francisco, she declared herself the representative general of the Sufi movement. The exoteric administrative title she claimed not to want, and announced she no longer recognized the authority of headquarters. And I comment here, it's paradoxical to simultaneously separate from an organization and announce oneself as its head.
Yeah.
What could have caused such a series of apparent missteps from someone groomed to be Inayat Khan's successor? It's clear from all accounts that Khan prized Rabia highest of all his trainees on both sides of the Atlantic. Pirzia's dissertation goes on for hundreds of pages, many of them describing at length the multiple centers, the Byzantine political and organizational structure created in Europe by Inayat Khan over time. For years on end, Rabia Martin's only connection to the Sufi work was the occasional instructional letter from Inayat Khan, now gone. She was over 6,000 miles away in an era where long-distance phone calls were a generation or two away, where she studied Arabic and the Quran and trained her own murids in a traditional Chishti manner. She had been busy with Inayat Khan's emphatic approval, recreating a medieval spiritual Sufi order in San Francisco. Her error in misreading the status-conscious, hierarchically oriented Europeans and committing personal faux pas led to being shut out of the succession deliberations almost completely. She only visited Europe once between 1927 and the final break in 1930, was not present for the infighting in the many subsequent meetings. She was the apparent victim of a political process and structure she simply did not understand and is not a part of. Rabia never had a chance. I make a comment here, I'm just going to paraphrase it. I find myself wondering why why did the Sufi movement in Europe not look toward India? They knew perfectly well about Hassan Nizami there in Delhi. He was treated by Inayat Khan as a superior, as an advisor. I submit that it's possible that they were so focused on Inayat Khan as identifying him on a level with the prophet, they literally could not imagine anybody else, possibly than a family member, as replacement. And it's also possible there may have been some faint color consciousness there. In those years, this is still the heyday of colonialism, and why would they get a brown skin in there, especially one with what they viewed as indifferent French or English. So every sign points to Martin's understanding of her role as Khan's spiritual successor. Note her understandable disdain of the European group's process, and especially of voting in a successor. Either we draw our authority from God or from man, it is one or the other, she said. So, for those that know their Muslim history, she was Hazrat Ali in a community which had elected Abu Bakr after the death of the Prophet. The Prophet had declared, "I am the city of wisdom, and Ali is the door to it." Ali was the vessel carrying spiritual knowledge to the world. Abu Bakr was older and an established part of the Muslim community and became the first caliph, successor to the Prophet, because he simply got more votes. To his credit, Pirzia acknowledges a similarity of Rabia Martin's situation in the Abu Bakr-Ali schism, that is the Sunni-Shia split, in the early Muslim community. This Sunni-Shia divide survives to the present day, with cause of much suffering. What Pirzia appears to have missed or did not discuss is that all Sufi orders, Sunni and Shia, except for one, which is the Naqshbandi Haqqani order, have Ali right behind the angels Jibril and the Prophet in their silsila, or chain of transmission. 1,400 years of Sufis have considered Hazrat Ali to have something crucial for the spiritual development, that's what it says, spiritual development of mankind, conveyed in the traditional transmission of knowledge from Murshida Murshid, the goal being illumination of the student. Pirzia may not wish to introduce this thought because it inevitably proceeds to the next idea. If rejected Rabia was that generation's rejected Ali carrying the spiritual charge, where does that leave the various other Sufi order movement branches? Idris Shah writes about what he calls remnant cults, organizations which persist sometimes for generations long after the Baraka or original spiritual charge is gone. On March 29, 1948, Meher Baba dictated a letter via Dr. Ghani Munsif to Murshida Ivy Deuce, successor to Rabia Martin as the head of Sufism Reoriented. It included this passage: "The spiritual worth of Rabia Martin consists in being appointed as Murshida by Hazrat Inayat Khan personally and directly. Hence, the effort on the part of Rabia Martin to obtain a written investiture from Hassan Nizami was altogether superfluous and unnecessary. She was the Murshida, there is no question. And as a Meher Baba devotee, I am reminded that all this unfolded during his lifetime according to his wish and his will. It was no accident. There is no injustice in the Sufi movement's rejection of Rabia Martin. On the contrary, it freed her to find Meher Baba." I am.
I think you're too kind to Hazrat Inayat Khan. Okay? He had all this time to set up all these organizations, to do gigs. He couldn't have written a letter, a cable, certified, sent everywhere, which would have said, "I make Rabia Martin my chargeman." And,
absolutely true.
Okay, so then that plays into your last statement, which of course is that that was deliberately done.
Yes.
If we assume that he was as illuminated as we ordinarily assume, that
believe, yes.
deliberate nebulousness was part of the will of God.
And how could he not? I mean, he was writing his thoughts to her on a regular basis. She may have heard the political chatter from Europe and discounted it as superfluous to her and her group, and assumed that what was true for her and her group was necessarily true worldwide. Yeah, yes, Ira.
I had spoken to Pir Vilayat Khan, Hazrat Inayat Khan's son, and Zia Khan's father, all about this very issue at length. And he told me that his father, Inayat Khan, always revealed to all of them that Rabia Martin was his direct successor, the only one he wished. And everyone knew that, including the people in Europe, the cousins, they all knew that. They were lying, because he made it clear all along. Pierre Vilayet said there was never any doubt. The only confusion or dispute was geography. Rabia Martin understood that Hazrat Inayat Khan was assigning her domain over all Sufis on earth of that order, whereas they understood that her domain was only North America, did not extend to Europe. So he said the only argument any of us ever had with her was not over these different things we're talking about, these different meetings, or what ego she bruised. What he said, and he was, right in there, he was the son, the eldest son,
Yeah,
and he,
I met him, I know that.
Yeah, and he said that the only question they had about Rabia Martin was that the question of geography. And that he and everyone else initially understood that when Inayat Khan died, there was only one person that was destined to take over, and that was Rabia Martin.
Well, I agree 1,000%.
And
I want to continue, to point out that I've met Inayat Khan as well, and I met him at the Abode of the Message in New York. So their acknowledgement of her domain over, that America was her spiritual domain, her responsibility, didn't stop him getting on a plane or didn't stop him getting on a boat. So I'm going to ask Tony has something to say.
Very importantly, there's a bigger picture to all this. Okay, the swabbling over, the person becomes the boss, for instance, it gets a bit lost in the bigger picture. And that is, meanwhile, Martin spreads her wings and goes to faraway places like Australia. This is exactly what Maya Baba did. Surprisingly, to Baba's declaration in Mashhad in Iran was, the purpose for his advent was for the emancipation of woman. And here's this female in charge of this always male order. We have, but people have done research in Australia for this. We have newspaper articles of her in Brisbane, in Sydney, meeting with the society, and she's obviously spreading her
Theosophical Society?
Just society,
right.
Whatever kind of that.
Right.
And set up, and of course, there's a Sufi order in Australia, which is directly related to her through the Baron.
Yeah, Baron Falkenberg.
And so, for instance, Bill LePage and all the other people, Dr. O'Brien, the Brufords and so on, all came out of the Sufi order in Melbourne. And as soon as Francis went to San Francisco in '52, whatever it is, and the Baron paid for all this, the Baron agreed with everyone else that Maya Baba was the prophet, called the prophet. And most people went to Maya Baba. The Sufi order disintegrated. There was no more need for the Sufi order after that, because Baba was the guy.
Yeah.
But there was resistance in America for Sufism and so on. So that's where you did the other thing.
Thank you, John.
This, for people's information, there's a really nice short video clip of Inayat Khan on YouTube. He's walking in a garden. Just Google Inayat Khan. That's it. Yeah.
In the garden.
In the garden.
Okay. Yes, sir.
One of the points that's very pertinent and not known well enough, or not even known in many quarters. I was told by Laura Delevingne and a few others. Now, Laura Delevingne, for those who didn't get to meet her, was a very advanced murid in the Sufi order from Detroit, and later on became also involved with Meher Baba. But and at one point, Murshida Martin approached Laura Delavina, asked her if she would consider the possibility of being the next Murshida. That's also not well known. I think that was before Ivy Deuce came on the scene.
Yeah.
But so she was already starting to look around who might be available for that. And Laura said in no way would she consider that. However, the point I want to make is that Laura told me, and this is so important, in 1923, during those 7 weeks when they met every day, Hazrat Inayat Khan and Ada Martin, for the bulk of the training, Hazrat Inayat Khan told her that the job of the Murshid or Murshida is not merely to train the murids, but they have the job to find the kutub of the age and align the order with that kutub. And he said, and if there's a Rasul in the world, it's the job of the Murshid or Murshid to find that Rasul and align the order with the Rasul or the avatar. And he told her, the Rasul is already in the world or about to enter the world. Be on the lookout for him, because he is going to be around in your future. And I am going to leave early, and you will have to find the Rasul. So she was charged by me. That is why she was going all over later on to Theosophy and to Norina Machiavelli's Thought Order Transmission, because she was looking out of duty to her teacher.
Absolutely.
To find the Rasul of the age, and she found him.
Thank you.
And that's very important. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
I was initiated by Inayat Khan at the age of 19, and I told him in that private meeting that I was a disciple of Meher Baba. He lit up like a Christmas tree when I said that. I preempt what I'm about to say because I wanted you to know that part. Now, when I went to India with him on a pilgrimage that year, I had said that I was drawn more to the Chishti order of Sufis. I had gone to California at age 18, and even though I was very well received, I guess my immaturity, they wanted me to cut my hair, eat meat, and get a job in a bank in order to be part of Sufism Reoriented.
Get a degree in accountancy.
Might have been a good idea, Paul.
Might have worked.
Outer world. When I brought up to some of the elders in both the San Luis Sufi order and the Irvalaya Sufi order were close friends in the greater Boston area about this issue about Rabia Martin, because I was a little bit informed of it enough at the time to know that it was an issue for me. I had a question about it. And more came out in my relationship with Meher Baba, and one of the elders said, well, he asked me a question, but at the same time, he seemed to indicate an expectation. He asked the question, well, if Meher Baba was the Sufi like he claimed, why didn't he straighten all of this out? To paraphrase what he said.
He loves that confusion.
Well, actually,
Exactly.
Here's the last
That's how
point.
Baba was.
And I paused for a second because I kind of felt like I might know a good response, and I said, I think he did. He appointed Murshid Ivy Deuce as the successor. As little as many of them recognize Rabia Martin, they even less recognize her.
yeah, but
So,
My expertise stops in 1930, okay? That's the extent, but yes, please, Dennis.
yeah, I have to say this. Many people don't know this, but if it happened to me, and because it happened to me, and I wasn't drunk at the time.
Sure.
When I went to be a volunteer at St. Peter's Hospice in 1981, and I happened to have to be interviewed by the volunteer coordinator because they want to make sure their volunteers are not crazy. And I walked into this lovely lady who turned out to be a Sufi at the Abode of the Message. And I'm getting my interview, and I look on the wall, and I see a nice framed photograph of Meher Baba. And I said, well, I know that guy. Oh, well, I mean, I know of that guy. Then, later on, to tell you how favorably Meher Baba was looked upon, by Pir Vilayat Khan, an abode of the message. I was at a meeting with none other than Darwin and Jean Shaw, and it was one of their, you know, meetings. For any of you who've been there, you know, sometimes you read from the discourses, mostly that was it. And two gentlemen showed up who were new, they weren't Baba lovers, and they introduced themselves and said that they had been sent by Pir Vilayat Khan to this meeting because of the belief that Meher Baba was the Qutub. Okay? So Pir Vilayat Khan sent two murids to a Darwin Shaw meeting to know more about Meher Baba because Meher Baba was the Qutub, or believed to be the Qutub. So that just goes to show you that there probably never has been spiritually any kind of friction there, because Pir Vilayat Khan, regardless of the politics of Murshidas and Murshids, Pir Vilayat Khan certainly accepted Meher Baba as the highest spiritual authority. And that's something that's very interesting, and many people don't know.
Jim.
I have the recording
What?
of Hazrat
It is true.
Khan here.
Well, I was there and you
I
weren't.
spoke to
Stop, boys. You have plenty of time.
I was
to
there
do
and you
that.
weren't.
This
So
is my time.
don't tell me what I saw.
No, I'm not denying what you said.
Okay.
Jim.
I have the recording on the phone here of Hazrat Inayat Khan singing, if you wanted to.
All right.
Lovely.
That's better.
Lovely.
One
Appreciate it.
quick word to Dennis. A response to it. He said, Pir Vilayat met Meher Baba in 1959 in India. And I interviewed Pir Vilayat about his meeting with Meher Baba. And I asked him point blank, how did you feel about Meher Baba? He said, I wasn't very impressed. He said, I've met many saints in India who I thought were far more impressive than Meher Baba. And so, I'm not denying what you say is true, but there was another side
He
of the story.
changed, yeah, but he changed his opinion because this meeting happened in 1981.
Well,
I would
the
like
meeting
to
is
state
1950.
that the
You know.
purpose of
I'm
today's
gonna-
meeting was to clarify some of the dynamics and interaction between Rabia Martin and the General Committee between 1927 and 1930.
Right, and that was...
Yes, Judy.
I would like to bring up the exoteric aspect out of a movement whose roots are Islamic, with all of the elements of traditional Islamic culture and attitudes, and where some of the roots are from India with all of its attitudes. How on earth could, at the political level, there be an acceptance of a woman, and maybe even a Jewish woman? So that's a kind of naive comment, but I think
And
it's
it was
reasonable to expect a negative
1927.
response in spite of all of the
Sure.
spiritual aspects,
We're
which
expecting
are very clear.
a lot of
I wouldn't,
white Europeans in 1927. After all, in America, women had only had the right to vote for 7 years. Yes, Judy. Sorry.
I just wanted to mention that Adele used to tell a story that, you know, she was working for Elizabeth and Narina in New York, and at one point, Murshida Rabia came to New York, and Adele, they gave her the job to take her around to the various places in New York, and she had a scroll that she would show them that certified that she was indeed the successor of Inayat Khan.
Well, it's very interesting, and Ijazanama possibly, and it's interesting that she didn't reproduce that. Maybe
Yeah.
she didn't want to send it. It's
don't-
difficult to know.
This was just Adele's story. so
Yeah, I
don't
believe
know.
you. I believe you. Yes, Tony.
Citing, it's in print in Lord Mayor, it's clearly stated that one of the leaders of the Sufi group, I'm not sure whether it was the Son of the Sun or whichever, had gone to India specifically to get on paper authorization from the Nizam and Ajmer. Didn't get it. Wanted an audience with Baba. Went to Bad Mirrors or whatever it is, and did not see Baba. I think Baba was in seclusion and refused to see him at all. Now, whether it's the same person you're talking about, I don't know. But it's clearly stated in Lord Mayor there was an attempt. And when I read that, I saw that as a verification that not to give authority to that arm. There are very facetious interpretations as two individuals came into power within that group. It's laughable what was said. what they said. They saw, they had a vision of Inayat in their lounge room. He came to them and said, guess what, you're the one. On two different occasions, two different people. Now, you know, really.
I suggest that you might get the names and emails of the people who have been adding to your talk, right? That they might write to you, the things that they'd like to say, that you should expand your article.
Yeah, certainly. In fact, I would like to point out that this chapter, if you like a copy of what you heard, and it does reproduce more of the letters than I actually read, I've got a sign-up sheet over there. If you give me your email, I promise not to use it for nefarious purposes. I will send you a PDF, a nice, happy, colorful PDF of this chapter. I want to make an admission. There is a gulf between what I just conveyed to you and what's in the book. I did not want to overtly identify myself as a Baba lover. I have 10 years with a Pakistani Chishti Murshid. I was cornered last fall. We were on visiting the Charleston group and having lunch, sitting across from this couple. And the guy was very refreshingly straightforward. It's like, why should I listen to you? I mean, white guy, you know. And I just blurted out, well, I spent 10 years with the Chishti Murshid. He goes, oh, okay. So that's my elevator pitch for why this is at least somewhat valid. And it's been reviewed by people like Karl Ernst and Alan Godless and Peter Booth. And
could you say something about the Murshid?
I was working as a computer programmer in 1971 in an automotive supplier in Detroit, or in Dearborn, actually, in the shadow of the Rouge plant. And you may know that Dearborn has one of the largest Muslim populations outside of the Near East. And I got to know this fellow who was an engineer in the company, and I was already reading Gurdjieff and Uspensky and Orage, and I had just discovered this book called Teachers of Gurdjieff by Raphael Lafort, in which he seemed to indicate that Gurdjieff had been trained by Naqshbandis, and I've just kind of got my head around the idea of Muslim mystics and Sufi things. Anyhow, he and I became friends. It took me 2 years to discover that he and his wife were murids of a very famous Murshid in downtown, in the slums of Karachi, Pakistan. He was in the States on the equivalent of an H-1B visa in those years. I don't know what it was called. He was actually, I was stood up to be a witness for him in his naturalization in 1976. So I spent a couple of nights a week at his place from 1971 through 1981, or late 82 actually. And he was initially just a murid, then a khalifa, then he kept going back to India, back to Pakistan. And at one point we went together to Lama Foundation, and we visited the Maqbara of Sufi Sam. There on the slope looking out over the Rio Grande Valley. And then he gave me a Sufi name after we returned to Detroit. And that winter, he instructed me to go back to Lama in the dead of winter. And so I flew to Santa Fe, busted to Taos, and then hitchhiked up the mountain, hitchhiked to the base of the mountain in January of 78, 79. And I walked up the mountain, about killed me. But they remembered me from the previous summer because I'd been there with Pakistani Muslim Sufi, and they kind of recognized that. So they let me stay. And in fact, I was invited to live at Lama Foundation, but I was a computer guy, and they didn't even have electricity on the mountain at the time. So I thanked them from the bottom of my heart. And stayed there for about 3 weeks, and sleeping in the Islamic Center, which later burned down, I understand. They had a horrific fire a few years later there in Lama. So that's my story. I left the Detroit area in '82 and never went back.
So how'd you come to Meher Baba?
In '68, I was living with some dear friends in a hippie house, and Aunt Lee, the auntie of one of the residents, had left a small collection of Baba books. And I know there was Avatar there. I can't remember what all, but I discovered Baba early on. And I heard when he passed, probably February of '69. And I was crushed, the fact that he passed without breaking in silence, apparently. I was actually pissed. And I wrote him off. I really did. I didn't forget what I'd read, but I wrote him off pretty much. And it wasn't until I met that wise woman sitting there and years later that she was already, had been to India, was with Baba. And it took me a long time. You know, a big tree sometimes really slowly, and that's my story. I came to Baba in slow motion. I'd like, yes, sir.
Samuel Lewis, we don't know much about Samuel Lewis, and yet he had a large part to do with this early center.
Well, Sam was kind of the main assistant to Rabia. In fact, Adele tells us that Sam was beyond irritated when Ivy was appointed Murshida. But that's, again, hearsay. We don't repeat hearsay in this room.
Rewind the camera there, rewind the camera.
That's right. And of course, Sam was the spiritual guide of the hippies and has his own movement at this point, Islamia Rohaniya Society. And Murshid Wali Ali Meyer. In fact, I roomed with Wali Ali Meyer when I was there in the late '70s in the winter. I stayed in a cabin with him for a week or so. Got to know him a little bit. I did not know that he would eventually become the Murshid of that particular order.
Sam stayed in that little room under the barn.
Did he? Okay. There was one more, and then I'm gonna.
Well, Karl, I have one question.
Yes.
You mentioned some basic documents that you've used in this presentation, including a PDF of a PhD thesis.
Yes.
Is any of that stuff available
It
openly
is.
online?
It is. In fact,
could you send it to people who put their...
The material is actually on the back of all of the sources, the ones that are still available on the web. Okay. Remember, I wrote this in 2015. And the book didn't get published until 2017. But the sources, the dissertation, appears is still available online. And the Glow, we could all look up the Glow from November 2004. That one, I was writing this, and I remembered something. Irma had a wonderful collection of Glow, as I said. I needed, and so I'm going through this stack of Glow magazines, desperately looking for that article that I thought I remembered. But it was there, and it was directly addressed some of these issues.
How about that biography that you referenced of Inayat Khan? Is that still in print?
Yes, the biography is by a woman named Elizabeth Keesing, and I'm not sure. Actually, I found it at the library, at the Soroya Library. By the way, it's called Soroya, not Saroja.
Saroja.
Just anybody that... Check it out, brother.
I will.
All right. We were told by a Farsi speaker that it's not Saroja, it's Soroya. But it's Elizabeth Keesing, and biography of Hazrat Inayat Khan. Keesing. Yes, Tony.
Just a small divergence. We've heard about the male squabbling over leadership and so on. Inayat's daughter, during World War II, was living in England. She joined the Secret Service.
Nora.
She awarded the George Cross, which is not easily attained. she was tortured by the Nazis. So
I think they made a movie of her.
how
They did make a
the woman was out there in service for the nation, whereas the guys are really, in my view, service to themselves.
Yeah, she's a remarkable woman by all description.
And there's a statue.
Well,
Right.
do wonders. I'd like to thank you so
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you for the show.